When the cream-colored envelope arrived in the mail, I almost threw it away, thinking it was another advertisement or fundraiser. It was elegant, thicker paper than usual, my name written in calligraphy I could never afford. I opened it out of mild curiosity, and my breath caught for a second. It was a wedding invitation from Claire Adams. The girl who used to split a dorm wall with me our sophomore year. The one who introduced me to oat milk, introduced me to yoga, and, unintentionally, introduced me to the brutal awareness of class differences. Claire, with her summer internships in Europe, her Apple Watch before anyone else had one, and her my dad knows a guy problem-solving approach to life. We were never close, but I always admired her confidence, or envied it. I could never tell. I held the invitation a while, letting the weight of the cardstock settle into my fingers. You're invited to the wedding of Claire Adams and Matthew Ellison, Saturday, May 3rd at Halewood Estate, Rhinebeck, New York. Rhinebeck, that's not just out of town, that's out of orbit. Part of me laughed. I hadn't spoken to Claire in over 3 years, beyond the occasional like on a post. Did she even mean to send this to me? Was it a courtesy? Or did she think I'd be flattered enough to show up and pad her guest count? I placed it on the counter and ignored it for 2 days, then 3. I told myself I didn't care, but something about that creamy card sat heavy in my chest. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the need to prove something to someone, though I wasn't sure if that someone was Claire or me. When I finally RSVP'd, I didn't overthink it. I just clicked yes. I didn't have much to wear. My job as a junior assistant at a boutique design firm barely paid my rent, let alone allowed me luxury fashion. I picked a vintage navy dress I'd bought for a charity gala 2 years ago but never worn. It was simple, timeless. I thought it looked like something Audrey Hepburn might have worn, if Audrey had gotten it off Etsy for $50. I wrapped the dress in tissue paper and packed it gently in my one medium-sized suitcase. I booked a train upstate and shared a ride to the venue with another guest I found through the wedding website's carpool section. Her name was Lily, and she worked in tech. She scrolled through emails while I stared out the window, trying to silence the creeping anxiety crawling up my throat. As we pulled up to Halewood Estate, I knew I was in over my head. The driveway was lined with fairy lights, even though it was still daylight. The stone mansion stood like a painting, all grand windows and ivy-laced charm. Valets in tuxedos waited to take our bags. Everyone stepping out of their Teslas and town cars looked like they'd walked out of Vogue spreads. I adjusted my sunglasses and clutched my small gift, an artisanal photo frame I'd found at a local market, hand-carved and wrapped in brown paper. It felt like a paper boat in a sea of crystal yachts. The first hour passed in a blur. Champagne flutes floated past me. Conversations erupted like fireworks around me, and no one seemed to recognize me, or if they did, they didn't show it. I smiled politely, hovered near the edges of groups and tried not to inhale my nerves. And then it happened. A woman in a shimmering emerald dress glanced at me, wrinkled her brow slightly, then leaned toward another guest. I caught just enough of her whisper, "Is she with the catering team?" It wasn't cruel, not overtly, but it landed like a slap. I excused myself to the garden, where rows of tulips bobbed in the spring breeze. My chest ached in that old familiar way, the way it did during freshman year mixers or corporate networking nights where everyone already knew each other. I hadn't been mistaken for a guest, I had been mistaken for staff. It's funny, isn't it? How quickly one comment, one glance can unravel the little threads of confidence you spent years sewing together. But if you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever been mislabeled, you'll want to stick around. Because this night did not end the way I expected. Subscribe now, because what happened next changed everything. The ceremony was scheduled for late afternoon, right as the sun dipped low over the Hudson Valley Hills, casting a golden hue across the estate. I tried to absorb the beauty of the place, really I did, but I couldn't shake the sensation that I was walking through a museum where I wasn't supposed to touch anything. The Halewood Estate was obscene in its beauty, impossibly manicured lawns. Fountains that glistened like something out of a European royal garden. Every inch of the place smelled like money, not the crass kind, but the kind wrapped in generational polish, discretion, and taste. Guests floated around like they belonged. Women in gowns I'd only seen on red carpets. Men in perfectly tailored tuxedos, laughing with easy confidence. I spotted a few people I vaguely recognized from Claire's college circle, but they barely glanced in my direction, which was fine. I wasn't here to network. The outdoor setup for the ceremony was on a sprawling lawn, framed by cherry blossoms in full bloom. Rows of white chairs, each tied with ivory ribbon, faced an arch dripping in white roses and eucalyptus. A string quartet played something delicate and classical. Everything felt curated, like I'd stumbled into a live Pinterest board. I sat near the back, not wanting to intrude or pretend. My dress, though elegant in its own right, suddenly felt like a thrift store relic. My shoes pinched. My hair, which I'd styled carefully into soft waves, now seemed too simple, too plain. And yet, I stayed. I reminded myself that I had every right to be there. I had been invited, just like everyone else. Still, I couldn't help but feel like the only one who knew I didn't belong. As the ceremony began, Claire appeared at the top of the aisle in a gown that defied description. Satin, lace, maybe both. She looked beautiful, radiant, the very image of effortless perfection. She smiled at Matthew, and he looked like he'd just won the lottery. I watched them exchange vows, and for a moment, the bitterness inside me softened. Whatever else was true, they were happy. That much was real. But the illusion cracked the moment the reception began. As guests migrated toward the glass pavilion, yes, a literal glass pavilion built for the occasion, I lingered near the garden, unsure of my next move. I was trying to psych myself up to blend in better when it happened. A woman approached from behind, her heels clicking confidently on the stone path. She wore a form-fitting emerald green dress with off-shoulder sleeves and diamond earrings that probably cost more than my entire year's rent. Her hair was swept into a sleek bun, and she looked every inch the socialite. She didn't look at me directly, not at first. She glanced at me, then at the ground, then back at me with a sort of clinical detachment. "Can you take this for me?" she asked, handing me her small, sparkling clutch as if I were holding a tray. I blinked. "I'm sorry?" She looked confused. "Aren't you with the event staff?" It hit me like a punch. "No," I said, my voice lower than I intended. She frowned. "Oh, well, you look like you're managing something." I managed a tight smile and turned away before I said something regrettable. The worst part wasn't the question, it was the way she didn't wait for an answer. She walked off as if I were invisible, like her mistake was my fault. I found a quiet corner near the catering tent and sat down on a stone bench. Around me, servers moved with trays of oysters and champagne. I wondered what it would have felt like to be mistaken for someone important, someone indispensable. Instead, I was the one blending so well into the background that I'd become invisible, or worse, utilitarian. I wasn't mad at her, not exactly, but I felt something brewing inside me, something I hadn't felt in years. That strange, flickering mix of shame and defiance, the kind that made me want to either run or scream. I didn't do either. I stood back up, smoothed my dress, and decided I would see this night through. Not for Claire, not for the other guests, for me. Because sometimes the best way to prove you belong isn't to say it, it's to stay. I hadn't been sitting for more than a few minutes before the hum of voices returned around me, guests filtering into the reception space. I followed the crowd slowly, still shaken but composed. The pavilion shimmered under the early evening sky. Chandeliers twinkled above and candles flickered from mirrored tables. It was stunning, and it was a battlefield I hadn't trained for. I stood near the edge, surveying the room, hoping to find someone I recognized. Instead, I heard heels clicking behind me again, sharp and assured. Before I could turn, a voice sliced through the air. "There you are," she said, like we'd been in the middle of a conversation. "I've been looking for someone to take this all night." She thrust a metallic clutch into my hands. Her voice was polished, just loud enough to draw attention. Her tone didn't question, it commanded. I stared at the purse in my hands, then back at her. It was the same woman in emerald green, "I'm not staff," I said, calm, clear. She blinked, confused for the briefest second before tilting her head and smiling as if amused. "Oh," she said, taking the purse back slowly. "Well, you blend." She laughed lightly as if that excused it, like this was just a mix-up, an innocent misstep, but it wasn't. She had looked at me, made a decision, and acted like my purpose was to serve her. I said nothing, not because I didn't want to, but because my words would have cracked if I tried, and I would not give her the satisfaction of seeing me flinch. She walked away, purse in hand, hips swaying as if nothing had happened, as if she'd just swatted a fly and moved on. I felt the burn in my chest long after she was gone. Around me, conversations continued. No one intervened, no one seemed to notice. Or worse, they did and chose silence. The kind of silence that thickens the air and makes you feel like your presence is a mistake. I stayed near the perimeter of the room, careful not to brush too close to anyone, not to stand too long in one place. The music was soft, jazzy. Laughter bubbled up from the center tables where the wedding party gathered, toasting with rose gold flutes and bespoke cocktails. Every time someone looked in my direction, I wondered if they saw me as a guest or as another part of the background. I reached for a flute of champagne from a passing tray, needing something, anything to hold on to. The glass felt cold in my fingers. I took a slow sip, the bubbles sharp on my tongue. I told myself I was fine, that she didn't matter, that one person's ignorance didn't define me. But deep down, the truth gnawed at me. I had felt invisible for a long time, not just tonight, not just at this wedding, but for years. At work, I was the assistant who made sure everyone else shined. In college, I was the roommate who stayed quiet while others took center stage. In life, I'd grown comfortable fading into corners, hoping to be liked, or at least not noticed too much. And here I was, so successful at blending in that I'd become indistinguishable from the hired help. The worst part wasn't the insult. It was the part of me that agreed with her, that tiny, insidious voice whispering, "This is who you are. This is where you belong." I stood there for a long while, unsure what to do next. Part of me wanted to leave, grab my coat, call for a car, disappear into the night before anything else chipped away at me. But I didn't. Something inside me refused to retreat. Maybe it was pride. Maybe stubbornness. Maybe that fragile, trembling hope that I could reclaim something before the night ended. I took another sip, held my head a little higher, and told myself one thing: you are not background. I was staring blankly at a centerpiece, an absurd tower of peonies and orchids, when I heard a voice behind me, warm and curious. "Are you okay over here?" I turned, startled, my heart briefly skipping. The man standing there was holding a camera, not just any camera, one of those expensive DSLRs with a lens as long as my forearm. His shirt was rolled at the sleeves, tie loosened just enough to signal he'd been working but not slacking. He looked like he belonged behind a lens, sharp eyes, patient energy. "I'm fine," I said, probably too quickly. "Just taking a moment." He nodded like he understood more than I said. "Weddings can be a lot." "Yeah," I said, then after a beat, "especially when no one knows who you are." He chuckled softly. "I've been shooting weddings for 8 years, trust me. Half the people in this room don't know who each other are. They just pretend better." That made me smile. He extended a hand. "Julian, I'm the photographer." I shook it. "Nice to meet you." "And you are just a guest?" Julian raised an eyebrow but didn't push. "You've got this look about you," he said, shifting the camera strap on his shoulder. "Like you stepped out of a vintage film. I was trying to get candid shots earlier and you caught my eye, twice." I felt my cheeks warm. "That's probably because I was standing awkwardly near the plants." "No," he said thoughtfully. "It's something else. Everyone here is dressed to impress, but they all look curated. You're not. You're just there, real." I didn't know what to say to that. I was used to being overlooked, not observed. Julian pulled the camera up, paused. "May I?" I hesitated, then nodded. He didn't ask me to pose. He didn't tell me to smile. He just clicked once, then again, and lowered the camera. "Perfect," he said quietly, almost to himself. It was a strange moment, intimate almost, but not in a romantic way. More like he'd seen something I didn't know I was showing. "You make people feel comfortable," I said, surprised by how honest I sounded. He grinned. "It helps when you're not from their world." "I do this full-time, but I'm still the guy they call the help." I blinked. "You too?" "Not at this wedding, but plenty of others. Rich people love memories, but only their version of them." There was a weight behind his words that felt familiar, the sense of being allowed into beautiful spaces, but never quite accepted in them. "I got mistaken for a server," I admitted, more to the air than to him. He didn't laugh, didn't wince, just nodded slowly. "You handled it well," he said. "That calmness, that strength." It was such a small thing to say, but in that moment it felt like armor. The music shifted to something lighter. Guests started migrating toward the dance floor. Laughter swelled. Julian stepped aside, letting me pass, but paused. "Hey," he said. "If you ever want a proper shoot, not wedding chaos, I'd love to take more portraits of you." I blinked. "Me? You? You've got presence. And trust me, that's rare." I didn't know whether to laugh or be flattered, maybe both. I gave a small nod. "Maybe." Julian smiled again, then slipped away into the crowd, already raising his camera toward another candid. I stood alone for a moment longer, oddly steadied. Someone had seen me, not as a background extra, not as a mistake, but as someone worth noticing. And that felt better than champagne. The clinking of silverware against glass signaled the start of the toasts. The music faded, the chatter quieted, and all eyes turned toward the bride and groom. Claire stood at the center of the pavilion, her hand entwined with Matthew's, glowing in candlelight and champagne sheen. She raised her glass with ease, like she'd been born knowing how to own a room. Her smile was genuine and her voice clear, warm. "Thank you all for being here tonight," she began, her gaze sweeping across the crowd, "to celebrate with us, to laugh, to cry, and to remind us that love is not just a feeling, it's a community." Polite laughter, glasses lifted, the usual wedding applause. But I couldn't focus on her words. I was still anchored to that moment from earlier. Tessa's smirk, the weight of her purse in my hand, the implication that I belonged somewhere lower. I watched Claire, remembering nights in our dorm when she'd fall asleep with her laptop on her stomach, half-written papers open beside TikTok tabs. I remembered when she cried after a breakup, when we shared cereal dinners on the floor, when she borrowed my coat and spilled chai on it. We were never best friends. But we were real once. Now, watching her surrounded by custom floral arrangements and an ocean of people with perfect teeth and designer shoes, I felt like I was peering through a glass I'd never be allowed to break. I caught sight of Tessa, seated at one of the central tables, laughing with a woman in lavender. Her hand gestured toward the dance floor, then briefly toward me. They both laughed, not loudly, but loud enough for it to sting. There was a war happening under all this elegance, silent, subtle, but real, and I was done pretending I wasn't a part of it. For a moment, my mind wandered, flashing to freshman year when I'd won a design award, and no one clapped louder than Claire. Or junior year, when I'd helped decorate the student gala, and someone called me the girl who sets the vibe. I used to have dreams, not just job titles. There was a version of me who saw possibility in everything. I missed her. And I hated that I'd let this night, these people, make me forget she ever existed. Claire finished her toast with a glowing smile, raising her glass one final time. To love, and to new beginnings. Applause erupted. I clapped too, mechanically. But my mind was elsewhere, pulling up pieces of myself from the floor. I wasn't angry anymore. I was focused. I hadn't come here to prove anything. But maybe I could leave with something reclaimed. Not approval, not revenge, just clarity. Julian caught my eye from across the room, gave a small nod. It wasn't flirtation. It wasn't invitation. It was recognition. And in that brief exchange, something shifted. The lights softened as music resumed, the dance floor opening like a stage. Couples began to drift forward, elegant and effortless. I stayed where I was, not quite ready to join, but I wasn't shrinking anymore either. The war, silent as it was, had just lost one of its casualties. The first few notes of a Motown classic spilled through the speakers, and the dance floor began to stir with life. People laughed as they took each other's hands, groomsmen spinning their dates, older couples swaying with practiced ease, younger ones hopping along with barely disguised awkwardness. It was chaotic and beautiful, a perfect kind of messy joy. I hovered near the edge, still unsure. My fingers tightened around the stem of my glass, condensation running over my knuckles. I had every reason to stay put, every excuse to keep watching from the sidelines, but something inside me had shifted. I'd spent too long dimming myself to fit into other people's definitions of success, of belonging, of beauty. Tessa's dismissiveness had sparked something ugly, but it had also lit a fuse, and Julian's words had added oxygen to it. Now I felt it, the subtle but insistent pulse of rebellion in my blood. I set the glass down and stepped forward. The lights above the floor sparkled like stars. I moved between two groups, gently carving out space. No one really noticed at first, which was a gift. It let me breathe. The music guided me, easing the tension in my shoulders, pulling me into the rhythm. I started slow, a sway, a step. Nothing too bold, just enough to feel the beat in my chest and let it override the self-consciousness in my head. And then I heard a voice. "Mind if I join?" I turned. Julian. He wasn't holding his camera anymore, just a slight grin and outstretched hand. I didn't answer. I just took it. Dancing with Julian felt surprisingly easy. He didn't lead too forcefully or try to show off. We just moved, naturally, without pretense, like old friends finding their rhythm again after years apart. Every now and then, he'd spin me, just enough to make me laugh. It wasn't about the steps. It was about the freedom. Around us, heads turned. People noticed. Some smiled, some watched longer than necessary. I saw Tessa in the crowd, her arms crossed, expression unreadable. She wasn't laughing now. I felt no urge to hide. Julian leaned in slightly between songs. "Told you, presence." I laughed, breathless but energized. "You're not just flattering your subjects, are you?" "Only the ones who pretend they aren't stars," he said with a wink. A different song began, slower, more soulful. Couples pulled in closer. Julian gave a slight bow and stepped back, letting me decide. I gave him a grateful smile and slipped away to the edge, my pulse racing in the best way. I didn't feel out of place anymore. I didn't feel invisible. I stood a little taller. I looked people in the eye, and when a few guests I didn't know smiled or nodded at me, I smiled back, not with forced politeness, but with quiet confidence. The night had changed, or maybe I had. I let myself soak in the music, the laughter, the feeling of being something more than a footnote at someone else's event. I wasn't background anymore. I was part of the picture, and I was just getting started. I stepped away from the dance floor, still catching my breath, the rhythm echoing faintly in my chest. The energy around me had shifted, subtle but real. People noticed me now, not because I'd done anything outrageous, but because I'd stopped trying to disappear. Julian found me again near the dessert table, where I was contemplating whether I could discreetly sneak a second slice of the lemon cake. "You looked free out there," he said, offering me a glass of water. I smiled, grateful. Felt like it too. He leaned against the wall beside me, gaze thoughtful. "I meant what I said earlier." "About me being a star?" I teased. He didn't laugh. "About your presence. I don't say that lightly." I sipped the water, letting the coolness settle me. It's kind of surreal. One minute I'm getting mistaken for a server. The next, someone with a lens tells me I'm memorable. "Funny how fast the narrative can flip," he said, "but it only flips if you stay in the story." I looked at him. He wasn't just being nice. There was sincerity in his eyes, the kind of grounded confidence that doesn't need to sell itself. "I have a shoot coming up next month," he said suddenly. A concept piece, non-traditional bridal mixed with editorial edge. We're submitting it for a small feature. I've been looking for the right person to center it around." He paused, then added, "I think it might be you." I blinked. "Me?" He nodded. "You have the kind of presence the camera loves, but it's more than that. You carry emotion in your stillness. That's rare." I didn't know what to say. The idea of modeling, even for an indie bridal shoot, felt like something out of someone else's life. Someone cooler, braver, taller maybe, definitely glossier. "I'm not really the type," I said quietly. "What type?" Julian asked. "The kind that gets seen?" "You're already being seen." I bit my lip. "I'm not sure I'd know what to do." "You don't have to," he said. "That's the point. Just show up. Be yourself. The rest is mine to figure out." I stared at the floor for a second, heart thudding. Part of me wanted to run, to slip back into safety, to politely decline and avoid the risk of being exposed. But another part of me, louder now, pulsing with adrenaline and pride, whispered, "Why not you?" "You're serious?" I asked. "Deadly?" I exhaled. Then, yeah. "Okay." He grinned, a spark lighting up his face. "Good. I'll send you the mood board next week." I shook my head in disbelief. "This is so unexpected." Julian shrugged. "So was meeting you." He left me with that, disappearing back into the crowd, camera now hanging again around his neck, already lifted in search of the next story. I stood still for a moment, letting the idea sink in. It wasn't about vanity. It wasn't even about the shoot itself. It was about something shifting, something small but seismic. For years I'd waited to be invited. Tonight, someone had asked me to step forward, not as a favor, not as a charity gesture, but because they saw something in me I'd stopped seeing in myself. And I'd said yes, not just to the shoot, to myself. I was on my way back to the garden when I heard her voice. Tessa. I didn't see her at first, just the tone, sharp and sweet at once, like a blade wrapped in velvet. "I didn't know you were friends with the photographer." I turned slowly. She stood by the wine station, glass in hand, emerald dress now slightly creased at the hip like she'd been sitting too long without grace. Her eyes were narrowed, her smile tight. "We talked," I said. "That's all." She tilted her head, pretending to be intrigued. "It's just, he seemed really interested in you. Said something about a shoot." Her tone dripped disbelief, but she was fishing. She wanted confirmation, wanted to hear it from me so she could figure out how to spin it. "Yes," I said, calm and clear. "He asked if I'd be the subject for his next concept piece. Editorial bridal, he said I had presence." The words settled between us, crisp and undeniable. Tessa blinked. Her mouth moved slightly before she recovered. "Oh," she said, feigning surprise. "Well, good for you. I guess anyone can model these days, right?" She laughed as if it were a joke, but the tension in her jaw betrayed her. I didn't flinch. "I guess so," I replied, "but not everyone gets asked." Her smile faltered. Something shifted in the space between us. She'd expected me to be embarrassed, humble, grateful maybe for the attention. Instead, she'd found someone who wasn't apologizing anymore. "You know," she said, swirling her wine, "when I first saw you here, I thought you were part of the team. You just had that vibe." I didn't respond. I didn't need to. "I mean," she went on, "your dress is cute, but very understated." I met her eyes. "You don't have to explain it. You saw someone you thought was beneath you. It happens." Tessa stiffened. "I didn't mean it like that." Maybe not out loud. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was liberating. I watched her fumble for the next move, but there was none left. She wasn't the one holding the power anymore. I was, and I didn't have to rub it in. I turned away, walking back toward the terrace with the garden view, leaving her standing there with her bitterness and a half-finished glass of Chardonnay. As I passed, I caught glimpses of other guests, faces I didn't know but who had clearly overheard just enough. Some looked curious, a few looked impressed. One even gave me a polite nod, the kind reserved for people who've just done something worth noticing. I didn't gloat. It wasn't about them. It wasn't even about Tessa. It was about me, standing there, knowing I'd drawn a line. That I'd finally spoken the words I'd always swallowed. That I had owned my presence, my value, without needing anyone's approval. That mattered more than applause. I paused by the railing, taking in the garden bathed in amber light. The air was warm, scented with lavender and peonies. For the first time that evening I felt entirely myself, not playing a part, not shrinking to fit, just whole. From behind I heard a soft click. Julian again. He lowered his camera, catching my eye. "You just gave me the closing shot," he said. I smiled, letting the words settle. And I knew this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of everything else. The party was still alive when I stepped back inside. Glittering dresses spinning beneath chandeliers, bass lines pulsing through marble floors, conversations folding into laughter and flirtation. But something in me had settled, not in exhaustion, in peace. I walked through the reception with a new stillness, the kind that doesn't ask permission to exist. I didn't feel the need to prove anything anymore. I wasn't scanning the room for approval. I wasn't shrinking or second-guessing. I had come here unsure of who I was in this world. I was leaving knowing exactly who I was in mine. I stopped at a small table near the exit, where the wedding favors were arranged, tiny glass jars of honey with custom tags. I took one, more out of ritual than interest, and slipped it into my purse. Then I turned to take one last look around. Claire was dancing with her father, her smile soft and full. For a second, our eyes met across the room. She gave me a small wave, genuine, familiar, and mouthed, "Thank you for coming." I returned the gesture, and that was enough. We didn't need a long conversation. Some connections are quiet but still real. Near the doors, Julian was speaking with a man in a tailored suit, probably another vendor or a curious guest. When he saw me approach, he excused himself and met me halfway. "Heading out?" he asked. "Yeah, I think I've stolen enough air for one night." He laughed gently. "You didn't steal anything. You claimed space." "There's a difference." I tucked a strand of hair behind my ear. "Thanks again. For everything." "You still in for the shoot?" he asked. "Absolutely," I said without hesitation. He handed me a small card with his email. "Shoot me your schedule. I'll send you the details this week." I nodded, feeling a small surge of excitement ripple through me. Julian hesitated for a second, then added, "You changed tonight. People noticed, even if they didn't say it out loud." "I noticed," I said, "and that's enough." He smiled again, kind, respectful, sincere. "Safe travels then." We didn't hug. We didn't exchange promises. It didn't need that. What we had was already complete. Outside, the night was crisp, the stars peeking through a velvet sky. I pulled my coat tighter around my shoulders and made my way to the gravel path where the shuttle waited. As the estate faded behind me, I thought about the girl who had arrived unsure, overdressed in simplicity, clutching her gift too tightly, and the woman now leaving, calm, grounded, no longer measuring her worth by someone else's perception. I boarded the shuttle, took a seat near the window and leaned my head back. No one in that room had changed, but I had, and maybe that was all I ever needed. 3 weeks later, the photo went live. I was on my lunch break, eating a salad I didn't want, and scrolling through emails when Julian's name popped up with a subject line that simply read, "You made the cut." I clicked. It was a small feature, tucked into the digital edition of a bridal and style magazine. Independent, niche, beautifully curated. The kind of publication that cared about mood more than mass. The title of the article was Unconventional Grace. And there I was, not smiling, not posing, just standing, looking slightly to the side, caught in that moment on the terrace after I'd spoken to Tessa. The breeze had lifted a strand of hair across my cheek. The light had softened everything. My dress looked richer, more intentional. But it wasn't the outfit. It was the way I stood, like I belonged. The caption read, "Real elegance doesn't try. It simply exists." I stared at the image for a long time, barely blinking. It didn't look like me. And yet, it absolutely did. The article itself was short, more visual than editorial, but it highlighted the inspiration behind Julian's shoot. A reclamation of presence, as he'd called it. It mentioned how the model, me, wasn't a professional. She's someone I met at a wedding, he wrote, and she reminded me why I fell in love with photography in the first place. The comments started trickling in. Strangers appreciating the simplicity, the rawness, the quiet command of the shot. Designers tagged it. A boutique in Brooklyn reposted it. A local stylist sent me a message asking if I'd be open to collaboration. I wasn't famous, I wasn't a model, but for the first time I was being seen in a way that mattered, and not long after I walked past a shop window near my apartment and froze. There I was, my image blown up in soft matte, part of a new bridal campaign Julian had helped produce. He'd submitted the concept to a local brand, and they had picked it up. I wasn't in a gown. I was in the same vintage dress from that wedding, holding nothing, just looking ahead. It was quiet, confident, real. Someone behind me said, "That's the girl from the article, right?" And I felt something bloom in my chest. Later that night, I sat by my window, the city humming softly below, and I thought about everything that had led to this. Claire's invitation, Tessa's purse, Julian's lens, and my own decision to stay, when it would have been easier to walk away. She had called me staff, dismissed me with a flick of her hand, but that moment, that insult, had nudged me into something bigger. It had pushed me to hold my ground, to step forward, to let myself be seen, not as decoration, not as background, as a presence. And now I was the face of something she would never fully understand. If you've ever felt invisible, if you've ever been mistaken for less than you are, remember this: sometimes the world doesn't give you a spotlight. You have to stand still long enough for someone to recognize your light. Thank you for watching my story. If it moved you even just a little, subscribe. I've got more stories like this where quiet voices rise and ordinary moments turn extraordinary. And if you're still in the mood to be inspired, click on the video on the screen right now. You won't want to miss what happens next.